Hello.
Hello. All right, participants are pouring in. Here we go. What is your weather like, Jean-Nicolas?
It's slightly changing, and it used to be very warm. It's getting slightly cooler and turning to thunderstorms, unfortunately.
That's not good.
They're always dangerous.
Yeah, but I mean, is it dangerous? The thunderstorms you think are dangerous even at this stage?
Yes, because I mean, it's been so warm. Vineyards are already that high.
Oh, you're kidding me.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Send me a photo. I'd love to see. I mean, Oregon, we're talking this amount. I mean,
yeah.
they're, you
have some photos on Instagram.
Yeah. I should take a look. Okay.
The question on your
question is new T-shirt. Yes, I have to cover that first. This is Cool for Cats. This is a Squeeze album, the second Squeeze album. Those of you who are old enough to remember Squeeze, and my first sort of job, if you will. I was still in college. It was the summer between my junior and senior year. My future partner, Miles Copeland, who managed Squeeze, said, look, I want you to go out and you're going to be the road manager for Squeeze on their entire tour. You'll learn everything. You'll meet all the radio people. You'll meet the promoters. It'll be fantastic. And so I flew to New York for the first time I'd ever been to New York and met the band at the illustrious Iroquois Hotel, which had at the time cockroaches and God knows what in the rooms, and met the band, and we launched our tour in a van, and I spent 3 months as the road manager for the Ageability tour, which was the next album after Cool for Cats, which had such hits as Pulling Muscles from a Shell, If I Didn't Love You, all kinds of great hits. But so that's the T-shirt. This one isn't really for Jean-Nicolas. I don't think he's ever seen it before, but he loves
I tried not to look at your T-shirts, actually.
Yeah, I understand. And listen to the music. So, okay, I think everybody is joining in here. Let's see. On the two bottles, why one red logo and one silver? All right, we'll get into this in a minute. Oh, we got some huge Squeeze fans. Fantastic. Okay, welcome everybody to our fourth in our series of webinars from Nicolas-Jay. Some of you have done some other sort of side deals. We had a little private tasting, a round table interactive tasting on Thursday night with 12 guests, and that was quite fun, in a situation where everybody was up on the screen. And I know all of you are Zoom professionals at this point, so it was a meeting versus a webinar. And I think we're going to do some more of those, so it'll be a little bit more intimate, where people can talk and participate in terms of some of the tastings, which you certainly can't do with several hundred people. So the webinars allow us to do this for a much broader audience. And today we're going to take on the subject of wine that is aging and the impact of aging, how wines age, how our wines, the Nicolas-Jay wines age, and the Nicolas-Jay wines, if you can call from 2014 aging. But yes, I mean, it has been 6 years since the first vintage. And we're going to talk about that. And we also want this webinar to be more interactive than perhaps the previous three that were more presentation oriented. You are all drinking some wine, we hope, and some older wine. And we would love to know what wine you are drinking. So if you don't mind, everybody that is drinking an older wine, to send that in so that we can share that information with the rest of us. And again, of course, your questions and comments are always welcomed. And with that,
wait a little bit before saying which wine you're drinking. You can wait a little bit. We'll have time to go into that, and we don't want to miss some fantastic wines that you're having. So that's great. Yes. Okay. I don't know if I'm going to be able to talk to you and explain and explain to you the mysteries of wine aging, because this is a big mystery, and in many ways this is unpredictable. There are general rules, of course, but many exceptions. So. Generally what happens with the wines and with Pinot Noir, and by the way, we can start with this. Pinot Noir ages very well. It's a soft and delicate wine, but it really ages gracefully and becomes very complex with age.
Do you
But
think that's, sorry, Jean-Nicolas, but do you think that is different or more so for Pinot Noir than say other grape varietals, other red varietals? Or do you think, do you think Merlot or a Cabernet Sauvignon or Syrah ages differently or less well, so to speak? Or
no, not necessarily, but I think that to come again to that old controversy or old comparison between Bordeaux and Burgundy, the Bordeaux, and it's less true now, but used to be so structured, so tannic, that they needed really 10 years, 12 years, 15 years to become drinkable, so to speak. Because they had this structure and also this kind of perhaps a slight imbalance at the beginning that mandated this aging and this so long aging. Burgundy being more delicate did not really need this. And at the same time, Burgundy is a relatively light wine. So 20 years after, it's still a very light wine compared to big southern grape varieties. So this is why, Burgundy could have been said to be not as age-worthy as Bordeaux. But, this is really relative. I think that all great wines are age-worthy. And of course, the next question is what is a great wine and why does it age and can it age? It's really difficult to answer that question. I think that wines that age well share a characteristic of complexity and a certain power. You need to have a good concentration to age. And I think also you need to have a good balance right from the beginning. You can have some edges, you can have a little bit of tannins, you can have a little bit of acidity, more tannins if we speak Bordeaux, more acidity if we speak Burgundy, but that can be a little rough at the beginning, but nonetheless, the wine needs to be balanced right from the start to age gracefully. It's not, and this is, I've heard Ageability say that so many times. This is not because it's not because it's not good at the beginning that it's necessarily going to age well. I've heard so many times, oh, this is too good, that won't age. It's not because it's very good and very drinkable at the beginning that it won't age. It has nothing to do. And actually, the vintages I prefer are the ones that are showing well all across their life.
Right.
And it's not that many, because usually what happens is that I usually love wines when they're young. Because of the fruit, because of the texture, and I love the freshness, the bouquet, the intensity of the bouquet, the red fruit, etc. I love that. And it generally lasts for 2 years after bottling, in my experience. Then after that, I think you're losing some of the freshness of the bouquet. It fades a little bit, and the wine enters a phase, I would not say a dormant phase, but a more adolescent phase, where you don't have the brightness and the spontaneity and the easiness of the youth, but the wines are not as bright and open on the nose, and yet on the palate they're not tamed, also not totally tamed. And so, they're a little bit of the edge, and they're not extremely pleasant. And then they come back.
What vintages, you mentioned that some of your favorites are the ones that are pretty much great all the way through, and they bring maybe different characteristics at different stages of their life, but even so, they're quote unquote drinkable, and they are enjoyable all the way through. Give our guests a few examples of those vintages.
Yes, absolutely. But let me finish just. And so after this phase, they're coming back, and generally, I say as a rule of thumb for Burgundy, I say 7 years after bottling. That is when you can start. So you generally add 2 years after the vintage date, and this is when they start to reemerge. So if I go now to more specific examples of wines that never really closed, I can find a great vintage like 1999, which was really for me and remains for me the great vintage of the past 30 years, because it was so charming. It was always enjoyable. It had this both this concentration, this delicacy, this seductiveness, and at the same time, it was always pleasant. You have lighter vintages like 07, for example. 07 never really closed, was enjoyable very early on. And you have more recently a vintage which is really surprising. 2013, I did a very nice tasting of 2013 not very long ago on the Instagram, on the domain's Instagram. And 13 was a vintage which was extremely cold, very tight, very strong acidity. But it's showing really well right now, and it should be really in the middle of its most difficult phase, and this is not the case. This is really still very, very young on the nose, and very open and soft on the palate. Very pleasant indeed. And here I have also an example, which I'm very pleased about, of a wine that seems to really never close and be very enjoyable. I'm speaking, you may not recognize this bottle because it has a very strange cap. But I have here a 2014 Bishop Creek, Willamette Valley, which is a wine that was very seductive, very sweet right from the beginning, and is now still showing that way, and still absolutely charming, and blossoming in the glass, and very enticing.
We have a number of guests who are also drinking the 2014 Willamette Valley. I see you're in the chat room. A number of you have mentioned that. So please put down your tasting thoughts and so forth. As you all know, that was our first vintage. That was the trial run, as it were. It is representative of the same vineyards for the most part. There's actually two vineyards that are slightly different, but 80%, 85% of the juice in that bottle is from the same vineyard sources that we currently use and have used throughout the history of the Willamette Valley. But that was an interesting vintage, very interesting vintage. Not only was it our first, but it also was interesting because it was kind of hot. And it had followed the 2013 vintage, where we almost made wine. I mean, we did make a little bit of stuff that we never really quite released properly, but from a completely different vineyard and a completely different situation. But we decided that we were not going to launch with the 2013, and then came, I don't know, 9 inches of rain in 4 days or something like that in September, and 13 became a tough vintage for everybody in terms of dealing with it. So on the back of that, we go into 14, and we had 7 days where it was 100 degrees or more. And that is not usual weather for the Willamette Valley. And during harvest, it was in the 90s as well. And it's like getting samples, and you're walking up the hill, and it feels like the vineyard is ripening as you're walking through it. And so this wine, when we released it in 2014, was, I suppose, Jean-Nicolas, the closest to the 2017 in the sense that it seemed ready to drink when we released it. And we got some fantastic feedback on the wine. It was a Wine Spectator top 100 wine of the year and all that nonsense, which was great. But the only negative feedback we got was that it wasn't very, remember you were like, it's not very Burgundian. Well, okay. It wasn't made in Burgundy that I recall. So of course it's not Burgundian, but you want to talk about the winemaking in that year and what made that a challenging year? And also, I think it's interesting, why don't you talk about how it's evolved? Because it's actually evolved quite differently than I think you and I thought it would.
Yes, of course. It was our first time, and you tend to remember your first times, it was challenging because it was, of course, conditions I had never seen with this heat, and I remember we had a few cuvées that I felt a little bit worried about because they were a bit cooked. I think
these cuvées. Sorry to interrupt, but I think we should probably not broadcast this, but why not? Where this is what this is about is getting coming into our homes and into our thoughts. But we picked too late in a couple of instances. I think we both feel like in the end we should have picked a couple of days earlier, and I believe that had a lot to do with what you're talking about in terms of in the cuvée.
Yes, so it was warm. Curiously, not extremely high in alcohol. I think we avoided this, but we had a couple of cuvées that were around 14% nonetheless. But yes, I was a bit worried after the winemaking. The wines showed well. There were a few cuvées that were, we knew right from the start they were going to be difficult, but otherwise the wines showed well. It's after that was a bit of a surprise because actually in barrels they evolved very quickly, and that was for me worrying because I was. I liked the wines after winemaking. They did taste like very ripe wines, which was normal. But at the same time, 6 months after, I tended to not to really recognize them because they seemed really old, really have to have taken some age. So that was a little bit of a concern then, a big concern, I must say. But we left the wines to themselves and we left them time. Did not want to rush them, and they slowly came back on their feet, recovered, so to speak. And this is the impression we have ever since. This is a vintage which is finding its balance, expressing, moving away from this sweet expression. It has less and less of that sweetness it had at the beginning. It's losing its fatness, but also its sweetness. Gives the impression of becoming fresher and fresher as it ages.
Which is
And
the surprising part, right? That's what I don't think either of us predicted, that it would get actually tighter as the time went on. I mean, I think we were a little afraid that it might actually start going in more of a flabbier, less together kind of way, which I know you and I do not like in our aged wine, which would have been very disappointing. But it did not go in that, and I actually like it better today than I did upon release.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, in Burgundy 2009 went that course also. It's 2009 was a very good vintage in Burgundy, very ripe. But a number of the trade said, well, you know, it's a warm vintage, and we prefer the precision, the uprightness, the leanness. It's more it's purer, it's more Burgundian when you have wines which are not so opulent. So, but the 09 vintage showed very well at the beginning, and then went into a phase where they really tightened. They really went into that phase where they weren't that interesting, I thought. Really, they had lost this generosity. They were a bit reductive, closed, and in the last 2 years, I think we are seeing wines coming back. The fact that they have tightened, they have acquired some structure, or rather, I would say that the structure of the 09 vintage, which was a concentrated vintage, the structure of the 09 vintage did show during that phase, and it shows right now. And I think that we have a very, very nice, we're seeing, start to see very nice 09s right now. I think we have a few participants who are tasting 09s tonight, and maybe they could tell us what they think about it.
There are some, I want to read a few of the comments on the 14. Lou says, drinking the 14 Willamette Valley, spicy red black fruit and mulberry with mild oak influence, still very fresh, tastes young, really good with good fruit, acid balance. That's the magic, Lou. Good fruit, acid balance. That's
yes,
that is the essence of what we're striving for. We'll hold my others for another couple of years. We've got Justin is drinking the 14 Nisa and the Willamette Valley. Says the Nisa seems much drier. And you're right, Jean-Nicolas. We've got somebody who's drinking Chambol Musigny Lacrosse from 09, which generous, elegant, and silky. Maybe we talk for a moment about what happens with wine aging. Most of you may know this from a technical standpoint, and I certainly am no scientist, but the aging of wine is really a matter of the alcohol, the acids, and the compounds, the flavor compounds and the phenolic compounds evolving, changing basically as they react with one another. And this is what really happens in a bottle of wine from a scientific standpoint. And oxygen, as everybody knows, is gated into that environment, into that closed environment via cork, or nowadays in Diam cork or screw tops, or a bunch of different holders. But the key being the amount of flow of oxygen coming in. And I think that what we're seeing is the different ways that these wines evolve. And this idea of a bad bottle, because we've all unfortunately had those, is when, frankly, too much, a bunch of things could happen. One is it could have been a cork that would have had something bad about it. Another would be this Primox issue, more with white wines than anything else. And then the last is that simply it just got too much oxygen in there and evolved too quickly. But Jean-Nicolas, maybe you can talk about some of the impact of this change in terms of maybe differences between white wines, red wines, and your experience with them, and some of the things that sort of make a bottle go bad, or some of the elements that, what is actually happening in that bottle when it goes bad. and then of course what happens when it goes good.
Well, we want to have we want to have a good moment. So let's not speak too much about the experience. Just touch on them. Yes, well, the difference between white and red. Well, in whites you don't have tannins, so the whites are less protected than reds against oxygen, because tannin can absorb some oxygen, and therefore it actually helps soften the tannins over time. So it really an ally in very progressive doses. It's really an ally of aging for red wine. But for white wine, you really want to protect it really from oxygen. You want some very, very, very small doses, and white wine aging is a bit more delicate, more difficult to apprehend and to monitor. So that would be the main difference between the two. What makes a wine go bad? It's difficult to say. It's first of all, I really think, and we've talked about that. I really think that a wine to age well needs to have some good balanced wine from the start. That is absolutely something that is necessary. If you have some, again, a little bit of tannins, a little bit of acidity, that's not too bad. So as long as if you have enough stuff behind it, enough texture, enough of the other elements behind it to support it and to make it age well. So what makes a wine go bad? Corks, of course. Corks, and corks are both the ally and the enemy of wine aging. The ally because they allow the oxygen to go through. If you have the right cork, it's exactly what it needs, and it's going to be very fine. And otherwise, if you have a cork that is too loose, the wine will age very, very rapidly, and not to speak about tainted corks. But this is really what can make a wine go not too well.
And what about a bottle of wine that maybe can age 30 or 40 years, and then another bottle after 10 or 12 is sort of lost its gusto, and it's sort of broken down, so to speak, chemically, and is flabby and soft and lost its flavor? What makes a wine capable of aging?
Well, if I had the answer, I would really like to have it. It's mind-boggling.
Not a fair question.
No. It's really difficult, and this is why I've taken the attitude of really, I think we need to do our best to express the terroir, to express the vintage. There it goes. The wine lives its life, and we're not really able to control it. And this is why we're very surprised, both in good and bad ways. Sometimes very surprised that such a vintage that's appeared a little difficult or weak at the beginning evolves so well. That would be the case of 2013 that I mentioned earlier. Or on the contrary, that some wines, some great vintages are a little disappointing, because you expect a lot from a great vintage, and sometimes it doesn't show. For example, 2005, it is a great vintage and it remains a great vintage, but God, it takes a very long time to open and to enjoy. The wines are so tight, so severe. They're just not loosening, and
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about 2005 and 2006 back to back in terms of those two vintages. And here in America, a lot of clamoring for those wines. And for me personally, the 2006s have turned out to be, at least thus far, a much better vintage to drink at this point. And it's interesting what you were saying about the 2009 vintage and how it being a vintage that you felt has been good all along. I haven't drank that many of the 2009s, but the ones I've drank, I had this sense that it was, as you say, a terrific vintage, but those wines were a little bit robbing the cradle. You had the sense that there was a lot more greatness to come. We have a question. Someone's asking.
Yes, I see a comment about and tasting notes about the 14s, and George, who has both the Willamette Valley and the Nisa, which is very interesting. I really agree with your analysis. Red fruit, leather, and earthy. Yes, this is always a wine that has expressed kind of some leather tones, meaty also, I would say. Yes, it has a good and long finish. Because you have a touch of acid here, which is really helping the wine, and that's really supporting the wine a lot. Well, I don't have the Nisa for to taste, but the Nisa was such a darling, and so caressing. Perhaps less long and having less of a kick than the Willamette Valley. But it's such a silky and charming wine. You might prefer something which is a bit more structured, I understand.
We have a question about Coravin, about what are our thoughts on Coravin, and how long do we think wines last using them, and just general opinions on them.
I don't think Coravin should be used for all wines. I think that I think it's a great tool. I use it a lot for my tastings, rather than for drinking. I think that's some people complain it hardens the wine a little bit. That could be possible. It's possible. I think you need to bring some oxygen into the wine after you've poured it into your glass. And I think that yes, the wine can left in the bottle can really age and stay in the bottle for quite some time. If you've taken only a glass out of the bottle with the Coravin, you know, if you've punched the cork only once, it can really still age in the bottle quite well. But don't push things for too long. You know, 1 week is okay, 2 weeks is okay, but drink up the bottle after that. It's not meant to age for years after that. It's a good tool. I would definitely not use it on very old wines, like 20-year-old wines. I would not do that. The corks are more fragile, and you're really, the way you serve the bottle with the Coravin like this, you're really,
shakes up the wine.
Yes,
sediment.
I would not do that.
Yeah, I don't own a Coravin for my own personal use. I mean, we use one at the winery for tastings, just in the sense if we're pouring single vineyards and so forth, where we have limited bottlings and we just don't want to end up with half a bottle of wine going to waste every day. But we use them there. But in terms of at home with drinking an older wine or whatever, I think if you're going to open that bottle of wine, you're committed. I mean, it's not a bad thing to be committed to drink that whole bottle of wine with whoever you are, or hopefully not just by yourself. Let's see.
Talk to us about the bottles you have behind you, and talk to us about about that wine, about old Pinot, California Pinot, how it ages and how does it feel.
So let me just talk a little bit about the Nicolas-Jay wines for just a moment, and about aging New World wines. One of the things that you may have heard me say before is that, to me, a real test of the wine's ageability is what happens to that third of the bottle, because you didn't use a Coravin, that third of a bottle that you put a cork in, or maybe you sucked the air out with one of those air sucker deals and you left it there on the counter that night. And then the next evening you come back to it and you open it up and you pour it into a glass, and what does it taste like? And we've had many experiences, all of us, where that wine is just gone. It's just like, ugh, this is flabby, and just, it doesn't have the structure. It's just completely gone away. And then we've had many other examples where the wine is not only there, but actually has taken on yet another whole new life, and it's different having had that oxygen for those 24 hours, but it's actually fantastic and really interesting. Our wines, the Nicolas-Jay wines, absolutely fit in that latter category. I mean, the next day, and what I have here is I did a tasting last night and with 2015, and so I thought it'd be interesting to drink that today, alongside you opening up the 14 and having that. But the other wine that you were asking me about is an aged wine. It's a 1998 Literai from the Savoy Vineyard. I'm a big fan of Ted and Heidi Lemon's winery, Literai. I've been friends with them and bought their wines since they really launched. They launched in 1993, I believe, was the first vintage. I remember buying a 1 acre Pinot Noir from the 1 acre vineyard. The Savoy Vineyard is in the western part of the Anderson Valley, out kind of near Boonville. It's a sandy loam vineyard. This was planted in '91 by Richard Savoy, and Ted was one of the first to get fruit from it. I believe he's been making wine from this vineyard since maybe '95. It's the vineyard, they sell grapes to Radio Coteau and Autour and Faella. What's his name? God, I can't remember his name now, but from Faella. But he started getting the fruit from there just recently. I love the way that Ted makes wine. I mean, Ted, as you know, was, or may not know, was schooled in Burgundy. He worked at Guy Rouleau, right? Was that 1990?
Yes, something beginning of the 90s, yes.
Yeah, for a few years. So his style is that way. But I mean, this wine at, what is this? 08. So this is 22 years old. And it has that brown edge that you might expect. I think, many wines would have. It's
color looks fantastic.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, the acidity's there. One of the great things about the way Ted makes wines, not surprisingly, coming and been schooled in Burgundy, is it has that balance between acidity and fruit. And he always has that in his wines, both the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir. And this is a very cool site. This is not very far at all from the ocean. It's hard to find cool sites in California, especially today. But the wine is drinking very well. I think I've drank a lot more New World Pinot Noir, obviously, than you, Jean-Nicolas, and was big fans in the early days of William Selliam and Rocchioli, Dellinger, Jim Clendenin at Aubon Clement has always been his wines I've really loved. And I think what I was sad to see is that as we got into the 90s, more into the early 2000s, you saw what I've always referred to as almost a Parkerization of a lot of the California wines, where the alcohol, Rocchioli, I think, went from on average like 13.3 or 13.5 up to like 14.4, 14.8, 14.6, things like that. And a lot of the wines did. And those are the wines that I think are real tough now. And I do have some of those wines in my cellar. And I think when I open up a 20-year-old bottle of wine like that, I think it's not as enjoyable. It doesn't really last well. It sort of starts to lose that structure. That fruit becomes more jammy and not pruny per se, but less sharp and has less definition. And it's not even so much of going, I mean, all wine as it gets older will go into more of the dried fruit category versus the fresh fruit category. But I think these wines that have a ton of alcohol, just more of candy fruit and just something where it's just losing definition. This wine is actually quite sharp and still very balanced and drinking quite nicely.
I'm sure it drinks, it will be evolving very nicely in the glass. Now, I think this is, talking about imbalance, talking about the fact that these wines are too much on one side, and that's sometimes, you can recover, they can recover from this, but sometimes it's not the case, and this is why they're not as enjoyable. But I've had the same experience as you did, and I'm really an admirer of California wines of the 80s and the 90s. I've had really wonderful experiences with these wines before they were really over alcoholic, and even Zinfandel, which is a great variety I do not really like. We've had together a very nice experience in Texas or in
Florida.
Florida.
Tell that story. That was a good story.
Yeah, Burns
Steakhouse.
Burns Steakhouse, fantastic cellar. They have 40-year-old Beaujolais, and they had for a few dollars. I exaggerate, but barely. They had for a few dollars an old Zinfandel from California for the 70s that was perfectly drinkable. Nowadays this is totally undrinkable. This is 16% alcohol. This is awful. But 12.5% alcohol 40 years after, it was a beauty.
It was a Charles Krug, for those that are noting this. It was a Charles Krug, I believe made, at least under the auspices of Peter Mondavi, in 1974. It was a 1974, 12.5%. And the look on Jean-Nicolas' face when because the cellar master and the head sommelier, who's a big fan of Mayo Camazé wines and early supporter, and they've been a great supporter of Nicolas-Jay, for which we're grateful. And we were there having dinner, and we said, well, Jean-Nicolas said, why don't you pick something? Go ahead, to the sommelier. And the look on Jean-Nicolas' face when he said, how about this Zinfandel from California? And I thought Jean-Nicolas was just going to die. It's just like, what? Zinfandel?
I think I had
do that to me. And yet in the end, you loved that wine. I mean, it was just.
I did. I think I mentioned to the sommelier that Zinfandel belonged to the wines I liked least in the world of wines. I did mention that before, so he took up the challenge, and that was great. It was a
great bottle, but I mean the balance. I think that really, again, that wine had acidity, still had structure, and had that lovely balance. Which
there was an interesting question from Jan in Germany. About whether we do things differently for Grand Cru or for Premier Cru au Village or Simple Bourgogne, whether we craft wines for age or not. Well, I think that perhaps in certain regions, wine regions, yes. Obviously, when you do a rosé, you do not make a rosé.
You don't do rosé.
Last.
Come on. You have nothing to do with rosé.
Well, I have nothing to do with rosé, but
tell the truth.
Yeah. No, I'm an expert on rosé because Tristan made a very thorough report on Provence. So I've read his report, and I'm an expert now, not by drinking, but by reading.
Tracy and I'll keep that in mind when we're making the rosé and you're scoffing at us.
So For example, so when you make a rosé, you don't make a wine to last. But when you make wine in Burgundy or in Oregon, I mean, we don't really do things differently for our various cuvées. And this is the same in Burgundy. I don't do things differently for the Bourgogne Rouge than for the Richebourg. So what actually the Bourgogne, the simple Bourgogne with us, ages quite well. It does age very well. It has a lot of structure, and it really ages. This is not a wine that the Bourgogne I really advise drinking too young, because it has some structure and some acidity that needs to mellow and combine and get balanced. But so no, it's really the I think that for the Grand Cru, it's really the complexity. It's really what makes them age worthy. The fact that because when they're young, they're quite powerful. You know, you most of the time you're very impressed by a Grand Cru. You're very impressed, and when you have very ripe vintages like 14 in Oregon or 18 in Burgundy, ripe vintages, you have a big mass of wine, of ripeness, of texture, of tannins in all the wines. What makes the difference between the Village or the Bourgogne and with the Richebourg is that over time, the Richebourg is going to show its breed and its complexity. It's, yes, a little bit of a mystery, but this is what happens. And I've seen the same in Oregon, and hopefully our wines are going to behave like this. And I think you need a good terroir, of course. I think also you need some vines which are not too young for that to
makes a big difference.
But yes, well, you know, at Méoquet Musée, there's no real different vinification between the Bourgogne and the top wines. Maybe we will allow the Bourgogne to be a little bit more, have a bit more yield than the Grand Cru. Yes, that's true. Otherwise, in terms of vinification, it's be very much the same. All right, so I have here a. You want to talk about some?
I just wanted to say that while you were talking, it was tasting the 2015, and again, this is 24 hours later, and this wine is not giving anything up. I actually, to be honest, I like it better today than I did yesterday. I love this wine. This is my favorite Nicolas-Jay vintage, personally, of the ones that we've released so far. I mean, it started out very dense and kind of closed, and I always had to double decant it. And last night when I opened it, I did not double decant it for the tasting. And I thought it showed very well. It's definitely the years in the bottle now have made a big difference. But drinking it now, it's opened up a lot more. It gives it a lot more on the nose. Maybe you can or can't see, but the color difference, obviously, but between 1998 and 2015, it's really a big color difference. But this is a wine that I think shows through this little experiment and many others, this is a wine that's going to age for a long time. The 2015 will be around for a very long time.
I was wondering whether this 15 might not go into its tight phase.
It could. It hasn't. But it's not.
You're saying it drinks better than before. So it has not really closed.
No, I would say no. I mean, it's still tight, but it still will benefit, I believe, from time. But it's definitely great to drink the next day for future reference. Anyways, talk about the Mayo wine that you're drinking.
Yes.
We're all going to be jealous of, I'm sure.
There was a question. This is a question I had. What's the black thing behind me? This is a crocodile from small crocodile sculpture from Africa. We bought that at flea market. No idea how old is it. It is maybe not very old, but I like the crocodile. All right. 1990 Nuit Mergé.
A strong,
So,
a strong choice.
Why do you say that?
That's great. No,
Why-
strong. I mean, a good choice. In other words, yeah, I'm jealous.
Yes, well, we tend to, in these days, to go deep in the cellar and say, "Oh, what the heck, who knows?" And let's drink that. If not now, when? I don't know who's the famous one who said that.
That is my pandemic approach to drinking wine. If not now, when? And
Exactly.
It's very pleased to see you utilizing that this evening.
No, it's a wine I wanted to rediscover. The 90 vintage is considered a great vintage, and it's a vintage we love to make and drink early on. Probably the greatest vintage of the trio, 89, 88, 89, and 90. Perfect season, perfect harvest, a little bit perhaps yields were relatively high, let's say, but perfect balance between acidity, which is quite strong and still showing in that wine, and ripeness, which was quite high and unusual for Burgundy at the time. A good 13% alcohol, which was considered very high at the time and more normal today. But a very good balance for these wines, and the wines that were right from the start seen as great wines. And I must say, this is a vintage which has held its promises. In the first 10 years, it was undoubtedly the greatest vintage of the 20 years. And surprisingly, 90 went into a phase of being a little bit more shy and less interesting, quite at an advanced age, I must say. When 10 years ago, the 90s were not showing so great as before. Is it because the standards had increased? What was supposed to be absolutely great at the time became a little bit more common. But this is the life of the wine. Sometimes it goes from ups and downs. But I must say that this 90 is showing very strongly tonight. Very good fruit, good aromatics, very, of course, tertiary aromas also, but a lot of ripe red fruit, and a good acidity, really a good strong acidity, good tightness. Now, this is a very vigorous wine that can age. It can age still. I'm very pleased with the showing of the wine.
So is that vineyard is the one that's right up close to Vosne Romanée, right? Is that the one that's all the way to the north?
No, this is Boudot. That is
Boudot. Mergère is the one that is up.
Mergère is right in the middle between Boudot, between Vosne Romanée and Nuit Saint-Georges.
That's right.
And this is I remember it was a relatively big harvest at Mergère. Mergère was still a vineyard that was something like 20, 25 years old. So not extremely old by Burgundy standard, and a bit production at the time. But Mergère has always had this balance between acidity and ripeness, and it really shows in that bottle of wine.
Yeah, I find those wines age very well. I mean, that particular vineyard ages quite well. You and I have talked about this before. I prefer, even though the 90 vintage was a heralded vintage in Burgundy and it had all kinds of press, I have preferred the 89s. And if you gave me a choice of if I was in your cellar or mine and I was able to pick out, either 89 or 90 bottles, I would pick the 89 pretty much every time. How do you feel about the 89 versus the 90? And have you had either? I mean, obviously you're drinking the 90 now, but what are the characteristics you see in those two vintages?
I've had a Brûlé 89 not too long ago, so it's
Like Tuesday night?
yes, something like this. Yes.
Good, good. I'm glad to see you're drinking well. That's the way.
Actually for Easter.
All right.
Was our Easter bottle, and 89 is more evolved. Is less young than this 90, perhaps a little bit more drinkable, more enjoyable, in the sense that it's really the wine, the old wine, old enjoyable wine. This is still a little tight, and the 89 was fully what you can expect and want from an old Burgundy. Doesn't seem that old to me, because for me it's still yesterday. It's my first vintage, still yesterday. But let's face it, it's still it's 30 years away. So
I was going to say, what's 31 years among friends? You know, it's just the other day, 31 years ago. I mean, that's an old bottle of wine, 1989. But I bet the Brûlé was drinking killer, because that feminineness of that vineyard and the way those aromas explode, I bet that was drinking pretty spectacular.
We have a question between 14 vintage in Aragon and in Burgundy. What wine would I choose to show against or along the wines, the two, the Nisa or the Willamette Valley 14? Actually, it's an interesting question. It's a difficult question, because 14 vintage in Burgundy is much leaner than in Aragon. Aragon, as we talked, was very ripe and rich and voluptuous vintage, whereas in Burgundy it's more upright. So I would choose a wine that shows some viscosity and some texture. I would choose a Bordeaux, which would be really a bit more charming, a bit looser, a bit more forward. I would choose perhaps a Corton Rognier to show against these along these Aragons. I would not choose Beauchaume or Merger or even worse, so to speak, a Corton Perrier, which are extremely either tight or lean or mineral, except if you want to do a contrast and see really the differences of character between the two regions. But yes, these are two vintages which are quite different in Burgundy and Aragon.
But I think what is interesting about your question is that we've done this. We've had the Mayo wines next to the Nicolas-Jay wines. The first time was much to my chagrin. It was at 11 Madison, I believe, for a Mayo Camazé dinner, and we had some Nicolas-Jay was poured at the beginning alongside it, and I thought that was a suicide mission. I thought that was sort of like kamikaze in World War II. Here we go. What are we doing, having the wines next to each other? But the truth is it's a fascinating thing to do. You learn a lot. I mean, the wines are different. They are certainly different. But what we've seen consistently, because we've now done it, Jean-Nicolas, a number of times, is people always talk about the texture and about how the texture of both wines is very, very similar. You may want to speak to that.
Yes, we share that between the two regions and the two wines, and this is certainly why it explains that I expect the aging pattern to be quite similar.
Similar.
Yes. And sometimes it's curious, but sometimes, you know, it's really an alchemy. There's something a little bit magic about the evolution of wines, and sometimes you know, it defies predictions, and you don't really know why you have a vintage really aging well compared to the other. And yeah, that's what is really fascinating about wine, sometimes frustrating, I can imagine, yes, for the wine amateur. But that is why we revisit every wine so often. And as a wine amateur myself, I think this is really what I enjoy by wine. In which state am I going to find the wine today, and is it going to disappoint me, or is it an old friend that is still there for me and ready to welcome me, or is it really not in a good mood today and leave me alone?
It's really one of the great things about wine. It can be frustrating, but as you say, but it's that there's nothing like opening up that bottle and you have this thing, you're kind of going, okay, and you open it up, you pour it in the glass, and then you just think, oh my God, it's just singing. And there's just nothing better. It really is one of the great experiences, which is why you're all here on this webinar discussing all of this with us, and why you've joined us. There's one or two questions here I wanted us to answer, and then we promised to try to keep it to an hour. There was a question from Brenda about the different colored caps. I assume you're talking about, well, maybe you're talking about Nicolas-Jay, or maybe you're talking, this cap was a mistake. Okay, that you'll never see one of those. In fact, if you have one of those, don't drink it, because it's going to become a collector's item. That was just a mistake. We have the black caps for the Nicolas-Jay red wines, and then you have the red emblem, Nicolas-Jay logo for the Willamette Valley, the sort of rust-colored, dirt-colored emblem and cap for the Own Rooted, and then with the Chardonnays, you have the green. But the green is an absolute ripoff of the Nicolas-Jay green, for which you have with the Clos Saint Philibert and the Corton Charlemagne that you make over there in France. But in terms of caps for Nicolas-Jay, they're, other than the white wines, the red wines are all the same, right?
Yes, absolutely.
With no variation.
No variation, no. I realized that my bottles have caps tonight, but normally you have a Burgundy cap.
Right. So one last thing we want to do is there's a thing they have here with Zoom, where they allow you to do a poll and to get some feedback from you guys. And so I am launching this poll in terms of to give you some feedback on these tastings, which I just did. Jonathan told me to do that, and luckily I didn't forget. So if you can give some feedback on that, we would be very grateful. The next one of these tastings is going to be about wine, sort of. It's going to be about music and wine. It's next Thursday, and it's going to be myself with David Millman, who is the current general manager at Domaine Duran in Oregon. And just with full disclosure, an old friend of mine who I drank wine with in the 80s and 90s, and he actually worked at IRS Records at my record company. He was our head of publicity for a number of years. And he and I have both ended up in the wine business, as it were, and him running Domaine Duran, and Jean-Nicolas and I with Tracy and team with Nicolas-Jay. And David and I are going to taste some wine and talk about that, but we're also going to be honest with you, be talking about bands and music. And there's a playlist that I've created for it, and we'll be taking questions and dealing with that. So that's going to be on Thursday night. And here in the next few days, we'll be announcing some new seminar subjects. We haven't really settled on that yet. But those of you that have ideas of what you would like to talk about and have us talk about, please don't hesitate to email us at info@Nicolas-Jay, or respond here in the chat room now in terms of there's particular things that you would like to see us talk about. But I think without any further ado, we've gone a little bit over, but we thank you all for your participation.
Thanks a lot.
And I hope you guys have a great weekend, and you guys are staying safe wherever you are. I mean, we have folks from London, we have folks from France, folks from Germany, folks from all over, and hope that you are staying safe and healthy.
Yes, yes. Be well, all of you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Donc je mets fin, je suis toujours en ligne. Ouais.